May 13th, 1968. 033, 0 hours. 40 kilometers northeast of Saigon, the night explodes with rockets and mortars. Fire support base Coral, barely 12 hours old, erupts in flames. North Vietnamese soldiers pour through gaps in the wire, overrunning Australian gun positions in the darkness. 11 diggers fall. 28 more bleed into the red Vietnamese earth. The Australians hold, but barely. The enemy withdraws at dawn, leaving 52 bodies behind. But they will return, and when they do, something is coming that will change everything. 52 tons of British steel. A weapon the North Vietnamese army has never faced. A weapon that will turn them. Before we dive deep into one of the most decisive tank actions of the Vietnam War, make sure to subscribe to Vietnam War Records and hit that notification bell. We bring you the untold stories, the forgotten battles, the real history of the Vietnam War that deserves to be remembered. Now, let's return to May 1968, to a fire support base that shouldn't have survived, and the armored giants that saved it. The story begins not with tanks, but with desperation. By early May 1968, the war in Vietnam had reached a critical turning point. 3 months earlier, during the Lunar New Year celebration of Tet, the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong had launched the largest coordinated offensive of the war. 80 to 5,000 communist troops simultaneously assaulted population centers and Allied installations across South Vietnam. The Americans and South Vietnamese repelled the attacks, inflicting catastrophic casualties on the enemy. More than 45,000 communist soldiers died in the Tet offensive. It was a tactical disaster for Hanoi, but it was also a strategic victory. The scale and violence of the attacks shocked the American public. Confidence in military and political leadership collapsed. Support for the war evaporated. President Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The war that American commanders had promised was nearly won suddenly looked unwinnable. In Australia, the reaction was similar. Prime Minister John Gorton declared that Australia would not increase its military commitment beyond the current level of 8,000 personnel. The Allies were wavering, but the enemy was not finished. Despite their staggering losses, the North Vietnamese moved quickly to replace them. By early May, 15,000 fresh pavillon soldiers were serving in Viet Cong units in South Vietnam. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of Vietnamese victories against the French and now the Americans, was preparing another blow. On May 5, 1968, the Communists launched what became known as the May Offensive, the mini-Tet, a second wave of attacks designed to influence the Paris peace talks scheduled to begin on May 13th. This time, the target was Saigon itself. 5 of 13 attacking Viet Cong battalions penetrated the capital's outer defenses, plunging the city into chaos. For 3 days, savage street fighting raged through the capital. American and South Vietnamese forces fought house to house, block by block. The world watched on television as the war came to the heart of South Vietnam. By May 12th, the fighting was over. The Communists withdrew, leaving more than 5,500 dead in the streets of Saigon. American casualties were also heavy: 652 killed, 2,225 wounded. It was the most costly week of the war for the Americans. But now the enemy was withdrawing, bloodied, depleted, moving north to regroup in their base areas, and that created an opportunity. The 1st Australian Task Force, based at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province, had been operating independently throughout the offensive, pursuing its own counterinsurgency campaign while American forces engaged in massive search and destroy operations. Now, on May 12, Brigadier Ron Hughes received new orders: redeploy north, intercept the withdrawing enemy forces, cut them off before they reach Saigon. 2 infantry battalions would move. 1st Battalion, Royal Australian, 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. Supporting arms would include cavalry, artillery, engineers, and aviation. The mission was clear: establish a fire support base astride the enemy's withdrawal. Force them to fight. Destroy them. The operation was part of the wider Allied effort called Operation Tone Thang 1I. The area of operations was designated AO Surfers. The fire support base would be called Coral. It was a plan born of sound strategic thinking, but the execution would be catastrophic. Intelligence reports identified several North Vietnamese units in the area. The PAVN 7th Division, consisting of the 141st and 165th Regiments under the command of Nguyen The Bon. The Viet Cong 5th Division, consisting of the 274th and 275 Regiments. The Dong Nai Regiment, various infiltration groups and support units. Allied intelligence estimated 3,000 to 4,000 enemy soldiers in the area. The Australians believed these forces would be dispersed, trying to avoid detection as they withdrew. They envisioned patrolling from company harbours, finding and ambushing small groups of retreating enemy. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Very limited aerial reconnaissance had been conducted over the proposed landing zone. Command wanted to avoid heavy ground fire. This decision would have dire consequences. The Australians were about to fly into an area where the headquarters of the PAVN 7th Division was located just 9 kilometers away. The 165th Regiment was operating to the north, the 141st Regiment to the east, and a fresh battalion strength unit, the 275th Infiltration Group, had just arrived from the Ho Chi Minh Trail 48 hours earlier. The Australians didn't know it, but they were about to land directly on top of a major enemy concentration, May 12, 1968. The fly-in began in confusion and chaos. Just hours before the operation was scheduled to commence, American forces operating in the area came under heavy attack. The fighting continued through the night and into the morning, preventing the Americans from clearing out and delaying the Australian insertion. Then the terrain around the proposed landing zone was found unsuitable for helicopters. Lieutenant Colonel Jim Shelton, commanding 3rd RA, was forced to designate a new location 1,000 meters to the southwest. Communications were problematic throughout. The American company providing security had to redeploy to the new landings. The 1st Australian Task Force was not well practiced in establishing large fire support bases. The operation became prolonged and dislocated. Units scattered. Confusion mounted. B Company, 3rd RAR landed first, under Major Bert Irwin. They moved quickly to secure the original position, but the New Zealand artillery battery arrived before FSB Coral was ready, forced to land in an improvised clearing 1,000 meters to the southwest. American forces still present in the western area prevented 3rd RA from deploying as planned. The battalion was forced to remain on the western side of the fire support base. 1st RAR's supporting battery, 102nd Field Battery, landed at FSB Coral. Major Brian Murtaugh, second in command of 12th Field Regiment, was designated as the fire support base commander, but his guns were physically dislocated from each other, scattered across the area. The delays affected everything. 1st RAR companies were forced to wait at the departure point before they could begin the air move. They didn't complete their deployment until 16:10 hours, more than 4 hours late. The 1 RA mortar platoon arrived on the last flight. It was now just 2 hours before last light, and the 2 Australian battalions and their supporting elements were not in a coordinated defensive position. They were scattered around Fire Support Base Coral in 4 roughly connected groups. The Task Force Tactical Headquarters remained back at Bearcat Base. Brigadier Hughes was not present. He had left to attend matters at the rear headquarters at Nui Dat. He was scheduled to move forward the following day. 3rd RA was responsible for security of FSB Coral, with D Company defending the northwest approaches. The other 3 companies were dispersed over 3 kilometers to the west, between the fire support base and the New Zealand gun positions. 1st RAR occupied the eastern approaches, with rifle companies dispersed over 5 kilometers in night ambush positions. C Company was isolated to the southeast, picketing the road to provide security for a convoy due to arrive the next day. The 1 RAR mortar platoon was particularly exposed, located in an open area on the outer edge of the base, facing north and east. The rifle companies provided the only protection, but there were large gaps between positions, gaps that could be easily bypassed. Command posts were done, weapons pits and shell scrapes were started, but many were not completed due to lack of time. Then heavy rainfall started at 1800 hours, filling the shallow pits with water. No claymore mines were laid, no barbed wire. The wire hadn't arrived yet. M60 machine guns were placed around the perimeter, but there was no time to test fire them or properly tie in their arcs of fire. 90mm recoilless rifles from the 1 RA anti-tank platoon were sighted to support the forward machine guns, armed with high-explosive anti-tank rounds and anti-personnel fletchette ammunition. The Australians were veterans of fighting the Viet Cong in Phuoc Tre province. Despite the hasty deployment and incomplete defences, they were not overly alarmed. They expected the enemy to be operating in small groups. Recent fighting involving the U.S. 1st Division just 3 kilometers to the west was unknown to them at the time. There was little thought of a major threat. Sentries were posted. The rest of the Australians stood down to get some sleep. What they didn't know was that North Vietnamese reconnaissance elements had been watching them all afternoon, watching the confusion, the delays. the incomplete defenses, watching the exposed gun positions, and reporting back to their command. Unknown to the Australians, the headquarters of the PAVN 7th Division was located approximately 9 kilometers to the east. The divisional commander received reports from his reconnaissance teams. Australian forces scattered, disorganized, defenses incomplete, gun positions exposed. An opportunity, a rare opportunity. One battalion of the 141st Regiment was quickly assembled, augmented by the 275th and 269th infiltration groups. The mission was clear. Attack fire support base Coral, capture or destroy the Australian artillery. The North Vietnamese moved, but the Australian infantry had noticed something. Companies from both 1st and 3rd RR had fleeting contacts with small groups of enemy at last light and into the evening. D Company, 1st RA, under Major Tony Hammett, contacted a 10-man group while moving into ambush positions 2,500 meters north of the fire support base. Brief exchange of fire, 1 enemy killed. 1 Australian, wounded by an RPG fired into the trees. B Company, 1st RAR, under Major Bob Hennessy, had another contact to the east, 10-man group. Later, A Company, under Major Colin Adamson, detected 20 North Vietnamese moving on the perimeter using newly issued starlight scopes. Some were killed or wounded, but these appeared to be chance encounters. The Australians felt no particular concern. They should have. By midnight, the rain had stopped. 5 minutes later, the 1 RRR mortar position was probed. A firefight ensued, possibly 3 enemy killed. Later, it became clear they had been marking assault lanes. At 0225 hours, 3 North Vietnamese from a forward reconnaissance party walked into a D Company ambush. Contact. 1 enemy killed. The others broke contact, firing RPGs that killed 1 Australian and wounded 11 from a single platoon. The Australians called in artillery. Helicopter gunships circled overhead. But despite the minor clashes, the North Vietnamese successfully bypassed the Australian rifle companies. Under cover of darkness and rain, they conducted a forced march. They dug in within 250 meters of fire support base Coral, undetected, waiting for the signal. At 0330 hours on May 13, 1968, rockets and mortar fire began falling on FSB Coral. The barrage concentrated on the 102nd Field Battery and the 1 RAR mortar platoon positions. An intense bombardment. 5 minutes of hell, then a 10-minute pause. Then flares signaled the start of the assault. 2 North Vietnamese companies rushed forward from the northeast, firing their AK-47 assault rifles. The 1 RA mortar platoon took the brunt of the initial attack. The 1 ATF defense platoon was pinned down by heavy machine gun fire. The New Zealand howitzers and 3rd RAR mortars began firing in support, but they could not halt the assault. The North Vietnamese overran the 1 RAR mortars. 5 Australians killed, 8 wounded. The flank of the main assault force ran through the position at speed, moving toward the gun position. During their reconnaissance, the enemy had observed the guns laid facing east. They probably planned to assault from the north, but shortly before the main attack, the battery had fired a mission to the north. Now the guns were facing directly toward their axis of assault. The main North Vietnamese force moved in long, straight lines, a frontage of 150 to 200 men. They advanced against the gun position. The Australian gunners opened fire over open sights with flechette rounds at point-blank range. Thousands of darts ripped through the enemy ranks. Successive waves broke into small groups. Follow-up sections hesitated upon reaching the mortar position. Other groups skirmished around the flanks between the artillery and mortars. Confusion. Chaos. Death in the darkness. The 1 RAR anti-tank platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Lestranter, engaged with flechettes from their 90mm recoilless rifles firing across the front of the mortars, relieving immediate pressure. But the North Vietnamese had achieved a break-in. The Australian position was being overrun. The 1 RA mortar platoon second in command, Lieutenant Tony Jensen, made a desperate decision. He directed the recoilless rifles onto his own position. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Bennett, mandated 1st RAR, agreed. As the enemy attempted to turn the captured mortars against the Australians, flechette darts swept the area. Everything above ground was cleared. Heavy casualties among the attacking force. Several mortar tubes damaged. The assault had reached the gun position. Close quarters fighting erupted between the emplacements. The attackers captured No. 6 gun on the extreme edge of the gun line. They attempted to destroy it with satchel charges, In both the mortar and artillery positions, North Vietnamese and Australians occupied adjacent pits, fighting each other at close range. The gun position officer Captain Ian Ahern coordinated the defense. The Australians drove off the assault with grenades, small arms, and flechette rounds fired from the anti-tank platoon. To the west, 3rd RAR largely remained out of contact. The assault fell mainly on 1st RA and 102nd Field Battery. The North Vietnamese troops were well trained and equipped, but they could not prevail against the superior firepower of the Australian infantry and gunners. Throughout the night, fire support was coordinated by the 1 RAR command post and the Fire Support Coordinating Centre. Integral fires from 102nd Field Battery, the New Zealand Battery, the 81mm mortars from 3rd RA. But the Australian gunners soon ran out of flechette rounds. They were forced to improvise. They used standard high-explosive shells with direct-action fuses set to delay. The guns were depressed to fire at the ground approximately 40 to 50 meters in front of the emplacement. The round ricocheted and exploded in the air above the heads of the attacking force. The expedient proved very effective. The Australians were also supported by artillery from neighboring American batteries in range, aerial strafing from helicopter gunships, continuous illumination by flares. Forward observers adjusted artillery to within 20 meters of the Australian position. A C-47 Spooky gunships fired thousands of rounds into the air. After an hour of intense fighting by 0430 hours, the main attack began to falter. The North Vietnamese withdrew into a rubber plantation to the northeast, carrying many of their dead and wounded. But a company-sized force remained to prevent the Australians from following. The Australian gunners engaged them with remaining flechette rounds and high explosive. At 0500 hours, taking advantage of the extinguishing of a fire the Australians had been using to direct helicopter gunships, the enemy attacked again, an effort to further cover their withdrawal. Greatly reduced in strength, the attack was quickly broken up in a crossfire of high explosive and flechettes. A series of sporadic contacts followed as the North Vietnamese withdrew. At 0530 hours, a helicopter light fire team became effective, forcing the enemy rearguard to abandon its positions. Rockets and mortars landed on B Company, 1st RRR, 1,500 meters to the southeast, killing one Australian and wounding another. At 0545, the New Zealand battery began firing on likely withdrawal routes as pre-dawn light appeared. The Australians began sweeping their position. The 102nd Field Bennett accompanied the 1 RR anti-tank platoon and a medical officer's party to clear the rest of the perimeter. North Vietnamese soldiers were located. The last was killed in a gun position at 0610 hours. 2 patrols met in the mortar position. A patrol from 3rd RA carried out a similar sweep from north to south. Fire support base Coral was finally cleared by 0625 hours. Evacuation of the dead and wounded began by helicopter at 0630 hours. The North Vietnamese completed their withdrawal by 08. The fighting had been costly for both sides. 9 Australians killed, 28 wounded, 1 howitzer damaged, 2 mortars damaged. North Vietnamese casualties included 52 dead, lying strewn around the perimeter, 23 small arms captured, 7 crew-served weapons captured. Radio Hanoi quickly announced a major North Vietnamese victory, but there was little doubt the Australians had convincingly repulsed the attack, even if they had come close to suffering a military catastrophe. The initial delays during the fly-in had left defenders spread haphazardly. Had the enemy assaulted without the preparatory fire that alerted the Australians, the result might have been different. The fortunes of war resulted in the Australian guns being laid in the direction of the main assault. The firepower they provided had probably been decisive, but the occupation of Fire Support Base Coral was one of the first such operations conducted by 1st Australian Task Force. Many deficiencies were due to inexperience. Command and control had been insufficient. The lack of coordination in setting up the defense could have been avoided with appointment of a local defense commander. Absence of proper aerial reconnaissance prior to insertion resulted in units landing on unsuitable ground in full view of the enemy. The delay in insertion of the 2nd Battalion denied them time to establish positions before nightfall. Failures in assessment and timely distribution of intelligence were identified. The lessons were harsh, but they were learnt, because the enemy would return, and next time the Australians would be ready, with something the North Vietnamese had never faced. The 1st ATF Forward Tactical Headquarters arrived from Bearcat by Chinook on May 13th. Additional personnel and stocks were brought in by road convoy, Brigadier Hughes arrived at 0800 hours. He directed Bennett to redeploy his companies in all-round defensive fire support base Coral. First, RAR consolidated defensive arrangements with wire, sandbags, overhead protection, and claymore mines. Tripod-mounted machine guns were in place to fire on fixed lines. Third RA established fire support base Coogee in area of operations Manly, 4,000 meters west. The New Zealand battery redeployed to Coogee. M113 armored personnel carriers from A Squadron 3rd Cavalry Regiment arrived at Coral, commanded by Major John Keldy. The M113s were split between fire support bases. 1st Troop assigned to 1st RRA, 2nd Troop to 3rd RA. Keldy was appointed local defense commander at FSB Coral to coordinate actions of units on the perimeter. 1st Field Squadron provided engineer teams. Other elements prepared command post bunkers and fortifications. The unsuccessful assault on the night of May 2, Thurs 3 demonstrated that the North Vietnamese would react violently to Australian attempts to control area of operations surfers, with 1st ATF deployed astride a key route to Saigon and threatening enemy bases and staging areas. Further heavy fighting was expected. Use refined tactics. Establish strong defensive positions to destroy the enemy by fire, rather than by painstaking patrolling. The fire support bases would be heavily defended by night. Battalions would conduct defensive patrols by day. Later, fighting patrols up to company size with armored support would locate and destroy the main force bases. The concept evolved from searching and clearing to reconnaissance in force operations from heavily defended bases. On May 14th, patrol clashes occurred in area of operations Bondi, as both sides tried to determine the intentions of the other. The Australians sent out platoon-sized defensive patrols 3 to 4 kilometers from Coral. In 9 contacts, they suffered 3 killed and 5 wounded. Enemy casualties included 12 killed and 2 wounded. Later, 2 more Australians were wounded by an RPG fired into FSB Coral. During the afternoon, heavy fighting resulted. 2 separate actions fought within half an hour by different platoons from 1st RA led to 2 Australians being awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Lance Corporal David Griffiths and Private Richard Norden. Norden's DCM was later upgraded to the Victoria Cross for Australia. In 2024, following a review by the Defence Honours and Awards Tribunal, the enemy appeared to be probing to gain information on Australian dispositions. These efforts continued the following day. Defenders observed 2 enemy soldiers near the perimeter of FSB Coral. Patrols from 1st RAR contacted small groups and uncovered a recently used company-sized camp just 1,000 meters from the base. By May 15th, the Australians considered their defences properly coordinated. Nearby, the PAVN 141st Regiment was again preparing to attack Coral after evading intensive patrolling. That night, a large number of lights and flares were observed by the defenders, warning them of the impending assault. At 0230 hours on May 16th, the enemy began a heavy barrage of RPGs and mortar fire, concentrating on A Company 1st RR, 1st ATF headquarters, and the Forward Task Force maintenance area. Now heavily reinforced, Australian and American artillery and mortars quickly responded with heavy counter-battery fire. 60 guns, 3 batteries of 105mm field guns, 1 battery of 155mm howitzers, 1 8-inch battery, 9 81mm mortars, all firing in, augmented by air support from 3 heavy fire teams, each of 3 UH-1 helicopter gunships, and 3 fighter bombers with bombs and napalm. At 0240 hours, the North Vietnamese launched a battalion-sized attack, initially falling on A and B companies. Even with artillery and mortars concentrating on close defensive fire tasks, the assault was largely held at the perimeter, but they succeeded in overrunning part of 3rd Platoon, A Company. Commanded by Lieutenant Neil Weeks, the platoon had been hit heavily by indirect fire during the initial bombardment. Several casualties. Concentrating on the gap created in the Australian perimeter, the enemy assaulted with support of 12.7mm DSAK heavy machine guns. Weeks ordered his men to fix bayonets. He successfully reorganized the defenses and called in close mortar fire to stabilize the position. Heavy casualties among the attacking force. He was later awarded the Military Cross. Unable to achieve a break-in, the enemy broadened their attack to include C Company, engaging 3 of 4 Australian companies on the perimeter. After successfully opening gaps in the wire, they failed to press home the attack. By 040 hours, a company was still heavily engaged. The Australians called in helicopter light fire teams and AC-C-47 gunships, which dropped flares continuously from 0430 to illuminate the battlefield. By 0500 hours, the main attack was halted. The enemy began withdrawing just as the Australians were running low on ammunition. During the lull, A Company was resupplied by armoured personnel carrier. The Australians pushed a recoilless rifle team forward to provide additional support. At 055 hours, the enemy attacked again, targeting the boundary between A and C companies on the northern edge of the perimeter, repulsed by mortar fire. Later, a 2-battalion attack on A, B and C companies was turned back. The Australians counterattacked with elements of A Company supported by APCs, regaining the lost 3rd Platoon section post. After a 6-hour battle, the enemy broke contact at 0630 hours and withdrew with their dead and wounded, fighting rearguard actions to prevent follow-up. The Australians began collecting casualties for evacuation. Another resupply completed with APCs. 1st RA commenced clearance of the area. 4 rifle companies patrolling to a depth of 1,000 meters. 1 enemy soldier killed, another captured. 5 Australians killed, 19 wounded. 2 US artillerymen wounded. Only 34 enemy bodies counted on the perimeter at dawn, but intelligence later indicated fewer than 100 of the 790 attacking troops survived unwounded. The Australians had won again, but at a cost. On May 17th, General Westmoreland visited Fire Support Base Coral and congratulated the task force on its defense. But now something was about to change, something that would shift the balance decisively. Back at Nui-Tet, the main Australian base in Phuoc Tuy Province, the Centurion tanks of C Squadron, 1st Armoured Regiment, Royal Australian Armoured Corps, received orders, move north. Reinforce FSB Coral. The tanks were about to go to war. The decision to deploy Centurion tanks to Vietnam had been controversial. Critics claimed the heavy tanks would be immobilized by rice paddies and jungle. They argued an enemy with modern anti-tank weapons could easily destroy the slow, cumbersome Centurions. Some called them expensive death traps. But reports from the field told a different story. The lightly armored M113 armored personnel carriers operating in South Vietnam were unable to force their way through dense jungle. They lacked firepower to deal with enemy bunkers. Infantry needed more heavy support. The Australian government decided to send a squadron of Centurion tanks in February 1968 at Pyrmont Wharf, New South Wales. The first 15 Centurion tanks were loaded onto the Australian National Line bulk carrier MV Jeparit, bound for Vietnam. The huge floating Titan crane of the Cockatoo Dock lifted each 52-ton Centurion from its rail car and lowered it into the cargo holds. The Jeparit arrived at Vung Tau on February 24, 1968. Getting the Centurions off the ship and moving them to the base was a challenge. Americans brought down a 70-ton Big John floating crane from Saigon, which lifted the Centurions onto U.S. landing craft utility. The LCU made short trips around the peninsula and up the Song Din River to a landing west of Ba Ria, carrying 3 Centurions at a time. From Ba Ria, the Centurions were driven up Route 2 to Nui-Tet. The squadron initially comprised 2 troops, each of 4 tanks and 2 tanks of the squadron headquarters, as well as 2 dozer tanks and 2 bridge layer tanks. The Centurion Mark 5/1 was a formidable weapon. Crew of 4, commander, gunner, loader. Main armament was a 20-pounder, 84mm rifled gun with a fully automatic stabilization system. It could fire accurately while on the move, a capability that would prove decisive. Stowage for 62 rounds. The ammunition types included canister, essentially a gigantic shotgun consisting of a black metal cylinder filled with 580 steel pellets, effective range of 220 × 9 meters. Shot, an armor-piercing ballistic capped round. Shell, a high-explosive round with instantaneous fuse. Hesh, high-explosive squash head, plastic explosive that can form to the target's surface before detonating, devastating against bunkers. White phosphorus illumination rounds. Secondary armament included a coaxial L3A1 7.62mm Browning machine gun with 9,000 rounds, and a ranging gun, an L6A1 12.7mm Browning M2 HB machine gun with 4,000 rounds. Armor was 51 to 152 mm thick. Engine was a Rolls-Royce Meteor IVB, 650 horsepower. 5-speed Merritt-Brown gearbox. Maximum speed of 21.5 miles per hour. Weight 52 tons. 54 tons with full fuel and ammunition. In March 1968, the Centurions proved themselves in Operation Pinaroo, a reconnaissance enforced mission against Viet Cong bases in the Long High Hills. The tanks traveled over 100 kilometers on their tracks. For 5 weeks, the Centurions worked with infantry and M113 APCs, destroying enemy positions that were very well placed. Only direct tank gunfire at distance could destroy them. The first 20-pounder round fired in Vietnam was on March 8, 1968, when a Centurion dozer tank assisted with land clearing. The tanks were fitted with bulldozer blades and cleared suspected mined and booby-trapped areas. 10 Australians were killed during Operation Pinaroo, 36 wounded, many by mines. But the Centurions proved their value. Now they were needed at Coral. On May 21st, the Centurion tanks were ordered to travel 120 kilometers from Nui Dat to Fire Support Base Coral, north of Tan Yuan. The slow-moving armored column departed on May 22nd, traversing difficult terrain that included old, rusting Bailey bridges that threatened to collapse under the 52-ton Centurions. Moving under cover of an observation helicopter, the column drove north on Route 2 to Long Khan, then west on Highway 1 to Long Bin, where they camped overnight. Just north of the Black Horse base camp, the lead vehicle, a Centurion dozer tank, ran over a road mine and was damaged, but there were no casualties. The column continued. Vietnamese civilians watched from the roadside as the massive steel beasts rumbled past. Tank crews took breaks, standing on their tanks, enjoying refreshing drinks. Long road marches created unexpected problems. Continually driving tanks on roads in high ambient temperatures caused the bonding of road wheel rubber tires to fail. The rubber shredded from the wheels. Spare road wheels were carried on the front glacis plate for immediate replacement. As a secondary benefit, they provided additional frontal protection against enemy rocket-propelled grenades. The convoy finally arrived at Fire Support Base Coral at 0230 hours on May 23rd. 4 Centurions from 1st Troop were allocated to 1st RAW. 2nd Troop was allocated to 3rd RAW. The Centurions took up positions on the perimeter. The Australian infantrymen looked at the massive tanks with new confidence. 52 tons of armor, a 20-pounder main gun, proof against RPGs. The North Vietnamese were about to learn. With 3rd RA achieving limited results at Coral, it was decided the battalion would re-establish at a new location to locate and destroy enemy bases suspected in the area. 3rd RAR occupied Fire Support Base Balmoral, 4.5 kilometers north of Coral, on May 24th. Hoping to provoke another battle. On May 25th, 3rd RAR began local defensive and familiarization patrols. 4 Centurion tanks from 2nd Troop, C Squadron, were ordered to redeploy to FSB Balmoral to bolster defenses, escorted by 2 infantry platoons from B Company, 1st RAR. En route, the enemy engaged the Australian infantry from a series of bunkers, pinning them down with machine gun fire at close range. The Centurions moved forward. The turrets traversed, the 20-pounder guns depressed, canister rounds fired. Hundreds of steel pellets tore through the jungle at 200 meters per second. The bunkers were suppressed, the vegetation shredded, the infantry was extracted. The Australians had struck the edge of a large defended base camp, estimated at company size, but they were under orders to continue to Balmoral before nightfall. They broke contact. The next day, May 26th, clearance of the bunker system was ordered. A combined force of D Company, 1st RA, and 1st Troop, C Squadron, was tasked with a reconnaissance enforced mission. Departing at 0600 hours in the morning, at 12:27 hours the lead Australian infantry platoon was hit by small arms fire and RPGs 3,000 meters from Coral, after pausing to direct an airstrike by Canberra bombers from No. 2 Squadron RAF onto a nearby bunker system. What happened next was the first Australian combined infantry and tank assault since the Bougainville campaign against the Japanese in World War II. The tanks were ordered forward. The Centurions rumbled through the jungle, tracks chewing through undergrowth, massive weight crushing everything beneath them. They attacked the bunkers with anti-tank solid shot and machine gun fire. The infantry identified targets with their M79 grenade launchers. Moving forward 2 or 3 abreast, the Centurions crushed many bunkers with their tracks. The sound was distinctive. The grinding of steel on wood, the collapse of earth and timber, the screams of men trapped inside as 52 tons rolled over them. The Centurions engaged other bunkers at point-blank range with their main gun. Further bunkers were exposed when foliage was cut away by canister rounds. The infantry followed the tanks using rifles and grenades. Assault pioneers provided support with flamethrowers. Artillery and mortar fire engaged targets further away. The bunkers were well constructed and camouflaged. Visibility was limited to just 10 to 20 meters in the dense vegetation. Many bunkers were not located until the Australians were on top of them. The bunkers were cited to be mutually supporting. The enemy defending them responded with a crossfire of rocket-propelled grenades, but the heavy armor of the Centurions proved impervious. The RPGs struck the tanks with metallic clangs, explosions, smoke. When the smoke cleared, the Centurions continued forward, unstoppable. The enemy had never faced anything like this. During a 3-hour battle, the Australians fought each bunker individually. Aerial reconnaissance revealed the bunker system was part of a much larger base area. With the size of the current force judged too small to deal with it, the Australians were ordered to withdraw, but they had made their point. The tanks were invincible. That night, May 26th, at 0:34 hours, the enemy launched a 2-battalion attack against Fire Support Base Balmoral, the PAVN 165 Regiment, preceded by rocket and mortar barrage. The assault fell primarily on D Company, 3rd RAR. The North Vietnamese had carefully planned this attack. They had intelligence on Australian positions. They knew the layout. They attacked in waves. Human wave attacks. Hundreds of soldiers. Disciplined. Determined. They had broken through Australian defences before. At Coral on May 13th, they believed they could do it again. But this time was different. This time, the Centurions were there. The tanks opened fire. The 20-pounder guns roared. High explosive canister. The sound was deafening. Each canister round released 580 steel pellets at muzzle velocity. At ranges of 100 to 200 meters, the effect was devastating. Entire squads disappeared. North Vietnamese soldiers advancing in formation were cut down like wheat before a scythe. The 12.7mm ranging machine guns added their fire. 4,000 rounds available per tank. The 7.62mm coaxial machine guns poured out streams of bullets, 9,000 rounds per tank. The combined firepower was overwhelming. Tanks, infantry, artillery, mortars. The assault formations broke up. The North Vietnamese tried to press forward, but they could not overcome the wall. After hours of fighting, the attack was repelled with heavy enemy casualties. The Centurions had broken the assault. The next day, May 27th, the Australians at Coral took the offensive. A troop of Centurions, supported by infantry from 1st RRR, assaulted bunkers located just outside the base. The tanks advanced, 20-pounder guns firing, high explosive, Hesh rounds. The bunkers exploded. The occupants were killed. The Australians destroyed the bunker complex without loss to themselves. The value of the Centurion tanks was vindicated in the most emphatic way, but the enemy had one more try. On May 28th at 0230 hours, the PAVN 165 Regiment launched another regimental strength attack against Balmoral, another major effort. This time the assault was called off after 30 minutes. The combined fire of the tanks, artillery and mortars was too. The North Vietnamese could not penetrate the defensive fire. They could not close with the defenders. They could not overcome the Centurions. The attack collapsed. The enemy withdrew. It was the last major assault on Coral. The North Vietnamese had learned a brutal lesson. They could not defeat Australian positions defended by Centurion tanks. The psychological impact was profound. The Battle of Coral-Balmoral continued through June as the Australians patrolled their area of operations. But contacts decreased. On June 6, 1st ATF returned to Nui Dat, relieved by US and South Vietnamese forces. The battle was over. It had lasted 26 days. It was the first time Australians clashed with regular North Vietnamese units operating in regimental strength in conventional warfare. The casualties told the story. 25 Australians killed, approximately 100 wounded. North Vietnamese casualties, 267 to 327 killed, according to Australian claims. 11 captured. The enemy sustained heavy losses and were forced to postpone a further attack on Saigon. 1st Australian Task Force also suffered significant casualties, but they had won. Decisively, the largest unit-level action of the war for the Australians. Today, the Battle of Coral-Balmoral is considered one of the most famous actions fought by the Australian Army during the Vietnam War. In 2018, Australians who fought in the battle were recognised with the Unit Citation for Gallantry. The captured 105mm howitzer, number 6 gun, retaken after the first assault on May 13th, is now on display at the Australian War Memorial, a silent testament to the desperate fighting. But it was the Centurion tanks that changed everything. The decision to send Centurions to Vietnam had been controversial. Heavy tanks in jungle warfare. Critics said it couldn't work, but the Australians understood something fundamental about armored warfare. Tanks are not meant to operate alone. Tanks and infantry are a team. Each supports the other. The infantry protects the tanks from close-range anti-tank weapons. The tanks provide devastating firepower and protection for the infantry. This was the British and Commonwealth doctrine, close tank-infantry cooperation. The Americans often used armor differently. Large armored sweep armor operating independently. Search and destroy missions with massed tanks. It worked in open terrain. But in jungle warfare, against an enemy who avoided direct confrontation, the Australian method proved superior. At Coral-Balmoral, the Centurions operated in close support. The tanks moved forward with infantry squads. The infantry identified targets. The tanks engaged with main gun and machine guns. When the infantry was pinned down, the tanks suppressed enemy positions. When bunkers blocked the advance, the tanks crushed them or destroyed them with HESH rounds. The combination was devastating, and the enemy had no counter. Their RPGs could not penetrate Centurion armor. Their bunkers could not withstand the 20-pounder gun. Their massed assaults were broken up by canister fire. The tanks that critics said would be immobilized proved highly mobile. The 52-ton Centurions bulldozed through jungle that would stop lighter vehicles. They forded rivers. They climbed hills. They operated in monsoon rain and dry season heat. The psychological North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers who had successfully ambushed American patrols, who had overrun South Vietnamese positions, who had fought the French to a standstill, now faced an enemy they could not defeat. The sound of a Centurion was distinctive. The roar of the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, the clank of tracks, the grinding of steel on earth. When that sound approached, the enemy knew what was coming. 52 tons of steel and firepower that could not be stopped. Veterans from both sides later recounted the impact. Australian soldiers spoke of the confidence the tanks gave them, knowing that if they got into trouble, the Centurions were coming. Knowing that no enemy bunker could stand against them, North Vietnamese veterans spoke of the fear, the helplessness, watching their RPGs bounce off the armor, watching their bunkers, watching their comrades cut down by canister fire. One Australian veteran, Des Kearton, deployed with the 1st Independent Armoured Squadron Workshop, Royal Australian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, later recalled the May 26th bunker assault. The enemy were hiding in B-52 bomb craters and bunkers. The Centurions went in to clear them out. Every type of round was used: armor-piercing, machine guns, HESH. Before 1968, the infantry relied on armored personnel carriers for defense. But when the Centurion tanks arrived, they saved a hell of a lot of lives. The battles around fire support bases Coral-Balmoral removed any doubts about the value of tank-infantry cooperation. Bombardier John Burns, who served with the 102nd Battery, Royal Australian Artillery, was there during the first assault on May 13th. He recalled the terror of the mortar and rocket attack, the sound above your head, about to drop, pitch black. Not knowing what was happening, the North Vietnamese ground forces attacking, artillerymen and mortarmen under intense fire, positions overrun, a gun put out of action. At dawn, the enemy pulled out. The second night, everything was ready. The sky was full of gunships. But Burns never forgot. The flashbacks continued for years. Post-traumatic stress. A day didn't go by without memories of Coral and Long Tan, and he was proud to have been there. Proud to have served with the other diggers. The Anzac spirit was alive in Vietnam. As we've learned, we're all one army. We need each other to survive. The arrival of the Centurion tanks at Coral was a turning point. After their arrival, no major assault succeeded. The Battle of Coral-Balmoral proved the value of the Centurion in Vietnam. Over the next 3.5 years, the tanks participated in every major Australian operation. Operation Blue Mountains, Operation Surfside, the Battle of Bin Ba in June 1969, where Centurions fought house to house in street combat, decimating a composite Viet Cong North Vietnamese force that had occupied the village. Operation Matilda in January 1970, the largest Australian armoured operation since World War II. 44 armoured vehicles swept through 3 provinces on an 11-day, 150-mile search. Throughout the war, 58 Centurion tanks served in Vietnam, including recovery, bridge layer, and bulldozer variants. C Squadron served from February 1968 to February 1969. B Squadron from February to December 1969. A squadron from December 1969 to December 1970. C Squadron again from December 1970 to September 1971. When each squadron was relieved, tank crews handed over their Centurions to the next squadron. The tanks continued fighting, the crews changed, but the mission remained. Support the infantry, break enemy assaults, destroy enemy fortifications, save Australian lives. The tanks did all of that. Remarkably, despite intense combat, despite hundreds of RPG hits, despite mines and ambushes, not a single Australian tanker was killed inside a Centurion by enemy action during the entire war. Crews were wounded, tanks were damaged, but the armor held. The Centurion's reputation for toughness was well earned. One Centurion, Army Registration number 169017, was badly damaged by a mine in December 1968. It was shipped back to Australia, rebuilt using a hull cannibalized from a Centurion purchased from New Zealand, and returned to South Vietnam in November 1970. It served again with C Squadron from January to September 1971. Damaged again in 1971, rebuilt again, the Centurion was that kind of tank, built to last, built to fight, built to win. The lessons of Coral-Balmoral extended far beyond Vietnam. Tank-infantry cooperation in jungle warfare became a model. The importance of proper reconnaissance before insertion, the need for adequate time to establish defenses, the value of combined arms, artillery, mortars, air support, armor, infantry, all working together. The North Vietnamese learned lessons too. After Coral-Balmoral, they avoided direct assaults on Australian positions defended by tanks. They changed tactics, more ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, avoiding set-piece battles. The Centurions had forced them to adapt. For the Australians, the battle confirmed what they already knew. Their counterinsurgency approach worked. Small unit tactics, patrolling, ambushes, but backed by overwhelming firepower when needed. The American approach, large-scale search and destroy operations, war of attrition, often struggled in Vietnam. The Australian approach, adapted from British Commonwealth experience in Malaya and Borneo, proved more effective in the conditions of Vietnam. Not perfect, not without cost, but effective. The Centurion tanks were part of that effectiveness, a weapon perfectly suited to the mission, supporting the infantry, breaking enemy assaults, dominating the battlefield. When the last Australian combat troops withdrew from Vietnam in late 1971, the Centurions went with them. The tanks were shipped back to Australia. Some went into storage. Some were refurbished and continued service. Some were eventually retired and found their way to museums and memorials. Today, you can see Australian Centurion tanks at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, at the RAAC Memorial and Army Tank Museum in Puckapunyal, and at other sites around Australia. Silent now, but each one tells a story of diggers who fought in a distant jungle, a story of men who crewed 52-ton steel beasts in tropical heat and monsoon rain, a story of infantry who followed those tanks into battle, knowing they provided the edge needed to survive, a story of an enemy who learned to fear the sound of Centurion tracks approaching through the jungle. The Battle of Coral-Balmoral stands as one of the most significant actions fought by Australian forces in Vietnam. 26 days of sustained combat, multiple major assaults repelled, enemy plans to attack Saigon, and at the center of the Australian victory, the Centurion tanks that broke the North Vietnamese assaults. Critics said heavy tanks couldn't work in Vietnam. The jungles would swallow them, the enemy would destroy them. They were wrong. The Centurions not only worked, they dominated. They changed the battlefield. They saved lives. They won battles. 50 years later, veterans gathered to commemorate the Battle of Coral-Balmoral. Old men now, but the memories were fresh. The sound of rockets incoming, the crack of AK-47s, the roar of 20-pounder guns, the grinding of the smell of cordite and jungle and fear. They remembered their mates who didn't come home, 25 names on the roll of honor. They remembered the North Vietnamese soldiers they fought, professional, determined, brave, worthy enemies. They remembered the fear and the courage. The chaos and the discipline, the moments of terror and the long hours of exhaustion, and they remembered the Centurion tanks that came to Fire Support Base Coral on May 23, 1968. The tanks that changed everything. The tanks that broke the enemy's assault. The tanks that vindicated the decision to send heavy armor to Vietnam. The tanks that proved, once again, that in war, firepower and protection matter. That combined arms warfare works. That tanks and infantry together are stronger than either alone. The lessons of Coral-Balmoral echo through military history. Proper planning, adequate reconnaissance, strong defenses, combined arms, courage under fire, discipline in chaos, the will to fight, the will to win. The story of the Centurion tanks at Coral is not just a story of machines, it's a story of the men who crewed them. Tankers who climbed into 52 tons of steel every morning, knowing that day might bring mines, ambushes, or massed enemy assaults. Who maintained their tanks in tropical heat and torrential rain. Who slept beside their vehicles ready to move at a moment's notice. Who fired their 20-pounder guns in support of infantry who were their mates, their brothers. The story is also about the infantry who learned to trust the tanks, who called for armor support when they hit bunkers they couldn't clear, who followed the Centurions through the jungle, knowing the tanks would draw enemy fire, would crush enemy positions, would break enemy resistance. The story is about artillerymen and engineers, cavalrymen in their M113s, helicopter pilots providing air support, all part of the team, all essential to victory. The North Vietnamese were formidable enemies, well-trained, well-equipped, experienced, determined. They had defeated the French. They would eventually outlast the Americans. But at Coral-Balmoral in May 1968, they met the Australians backed by Centurion tanks, and they could not prevail. They tried 3 major assaults, hundreds of casualties, but they could not break through. The Centurions held the line. The 1st Australian Task Force returned to Nui Dat on June 6, 1968. The Battle of Coral-Balmoral was over, but the war continued. The Centurions continued to serve. More operations, more battles, more enemy positions destroyed, more Australian lives saved. When the final accounting was done, when the last Australian soldiers left Vietnam in 1972, the Centurions' record was clear: 58 tanks deployed, thousands of rounds fired, hundreds of enemy positions destroyed, countless assaults broken, and not a single crew member killed by enemy action inside a tank. That record speaks to the quality of the Centurion design, the thickness of its armor, the power of its gun, the skill of its crews, the tactics employed. But it also speaks to luck, to the fortunes of war, to the fact that in combat, nothing is certain. The Australians who fought at Coral-Balmoral knew that. They had seen friends die. They had seen positions overrun. They had felt the ground shake from incoming. They had fought desperate close-quarters battles in the darkness. They knew how close they had come to disaster on the night of May 2-13, 1-3. How the lack of Centurion tanks in that first assault nearly cost them everything. And they knew how the arrival of those tanks changed the equation, gave them the confidence to attack, the edge needed to win. Today, the lessons of Coral-Balmoral are studied in military academies. The battle is taught as an example of combined arms warfare, of tank-infantry cooperation, of the importance of firepower in defensive operations, of how military historians analyze the decisions made, the mistakes and the successes. But for the men who were there, the lessons are simpler. Trust your mates. Do your job. Keep your weapon clean. Dig your hole deep. When the tanks arrive, follow them. When the enemy attacks, stand, fight, survive, win. Those simple lessons, learned in the jungles of Vietnam, fought with Australian blood, validated by Australian victory, are the real legacy of Coral-Balmoral. The Centurion tanks that broke the North Vietnamese assaults are now museum pieces, relics of a war long past. But the men who crewed them, the infantry who fought beside them, the enemy who faced them, all knew the truth. In May 1968, at Fire Support Base Coral, the Centurion tanks were the difference between victory and defeat, between survival and destruction, between holding the line and being overrun. The North Vietnamese came to Coral expecting to crush the Australians. They came in regimental strength. They came with courage and determination. They came to win. But they met 52 tons of British steel, crewed by Australian tankers. They met the 20-pounder gun. They met canister rounds that shredded infantry formations. They met armor that could not be penetrated. They met a defense that could not be, and so the story ends where it began, in the jungles north of Saigon, at a fire support base called Coral, where Australian diggers stood their ground against overwhelming odds, where North Vietnamese soldiers attacked with courage and died in waves, where the fortunes of war turned on firepower and discipline, and the arrival of Centurion tanks. The battle is over. The war is over. The soldiers on both sides are old men now, or gone. The lesson remains. The story remains. How Australian Centurion tanks broke the NEA's Coral assault. How 52 tons of steel and the men who crewed them changed the course of a battle. How combined arms warfare, proper tactics, and sheer determination won the day. This is the story we must remember. This is the history that must not be forgotten. The young men, the infantry who followed them into battle, the gunners who fired in support, the engineers who kept them running, the commanders who made the decisions, all of them, Australian and New Zealand, allies in a distant war, brothers in arms. They fought, they bled, they won, and 52 tons of Centurion armor was at the heart of that victory. If this documentary gave you a deeper understanding of one of the most critical tank actions of the Vietnam War, make sure you're subscribed to Vietnam War Records. Hit that like button, share this video with anyone interested in military history, and drop a comment below telling us what you found most surprising about the Battle of Coral-Balmoral. We're dedicated to bringing you the real stories, the verified history, the battles that shaped the war. From the Australian SAS to the Centurion tanks, from the jungles of Fort 2 to the fire support bases north of Saigon, we cover it all. Next time, we'll explore another chapter of this war that changed the world. Until then, remember the diggers of Coral-Balmoral. Remember the Centurion crews who rolled into battle. Remember the lesson they taught. That courage, firepower, and the right. That's the story of Fire Support Base Coral. That's the story of the Australian Centurions. That's the history we must never forget.